take great pleasure in introducing a man that probably knows more about Horicon history and ecology than any human being. He started for DNR as an LTE in 1981 before becoming the wildlife educator and naturalist at Horicon in 1988. He's featured in Sumner Madison's excellent book that featured all the best naturalists of Wisconsin. And in there, Sumner describes this guy like this. Over 23 years before leaving the department in 2011, Bill brought the attention to Horicon Marsh like no other, giving more than 3,700 educational programs for over 2,110,000 people, including training scientists for 43 countries. During that time, he presented over 900 media interviews, and outside of the job, he presented over 500 lectures on subjects as diverse as hunting in birding in Central and South America, Russia, Mongolia, Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. I think his other credentials are equally as exemplary. He gave 200 appearances at Wisconsin Public Radio, 8 trips to Russia to work on projects to protect Lake Baikal, 2 watershed study trips in Mongolia. He worked on a national bird conservation education plan for Nicaragua that leads birding trips there almost every year. Our speaker has traveled throughout the world to observe birds in the wild and in their habitats. In 2015, he and his wife undertook a 7.5-month round-the-world trip covering 55,000 miles in over 12 countries. And he wrote a book about it. His bird sighting, his life list now is at 4,200. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Bill Volker.
Thank you very much, Dave. Thanks so much for the invitation and making this possible. And also thanks to all of you. So nice to see all of you again. And also it was a pleasure to have shared a career with many of you, either remotely, indirectly, or some of you had a chance to work with directly. When we talked about a presentation topic, I said, well, I could talk about some of my travels and some of the experiences I've had in exotic places, but I really wanted to share with you the story of Horicon Marsh because it's something that was really the foundation of my career, and I'm sure that everybody in this room knows something about Horicon, but I also have a feeling that as I go through this story, you're all going to learn something about the marsh that you did not know as one of our more outstanding natural resources in the state. Before I begin, I want to share a little anecdote with you, and I think this is somewhat integral to why I chose this presentation. It was either during my LTE stint at Horicon, just beginning my career, or maybe like the first year as a full-time employee. I can still picture it as more than 35 years ago. It was a fall day, October, beautiful day like today, nice and cool. And I was standing on that hill at Palmatory Street, where the old headquarters was. And if anybody's been there, you know that view looking down the full length of the marsh. I was there to conduct a public education program, and all of a sudden a car pulled up. It was a Lincoln Continental, kind of a tan copper color, Illinois plates, and an upper middle-aged couple stepped out of the car. The man was wearing this nice colorful sweater and dress shoes, so I knew they were not going to hike the trails and really explore the marsh. It was the windshield tour. They were just there to tour around. His wife got out and looked at that view across the marsh and literally came up to me, clasped her hands, and she said, "Isn't it so nice you preserved this?" I said, well, if you're interested in learning about the marsh, I'm going to be doing an outdoor talk here on the history in about 5 minutes. Would you like to join me? She said, oh, yes, we would love to hear about this. We've never been here before. So as I started with the story, as I'll share with you today, about the geology and overview of the Indian history, you could see she was quite enthralled in getting a picture of what the marsh had been. Then I got into the settlement history. And it started with a little bit of shock, horror, and complete disillusionment. And what she thought was a marsh that we preserved, it was something that she came to a realization that this went through a brutal history. I realized right then and there that no matter what I shared with the visitors, no matter what I talked about with the marsh, if I didn't give them at least an overview of the history, everything else was without context, without meaning. So for the vast majority of the presentations that I did, which as Dave said was a little over 3,700 public programs, well over half of those, I gave everybody some overview of the history, whether it was just young school kids or visitors with another theme and focus, that I quick gave them a 5-minute talk, or like today that the talk was focused exclusively on the history of the marsh. And I can quite honestly say I've given this story well over 2,000 times. But I had to remind myself every time that I gave that whoever I told it to, this was going to be their first time. So I always tried to give it as if it was my first time too, to have some enthusiasm. I couldn't get bored with my own talk. But the story of Horicon Marsh is not just the story and the history of that particular marsh. In a sense, it's the story of wetlands all across the upper Midwest. The unique thing about Horicon is everything you can imagine doing to a wetland happened at that one single marsh and on a grand scale. So in a sense, it's just not just a story of us and Horicon, it is a story of human relations with wetlands and also an evolving relationship that we've had with Horicon. I just hope that we've learned enough lessons over time. So let me give it a little bit of an overview then of the past of the Horicon Marsh, and as I said, hopefully something new for each person here. So as you're all familiar, Horicon Marsh lies in east central Wisconsin. Most of it's in Dodge County, a little bit going into Fond du Lac County to the north. The marsh, 13.5 miles long, 3 to 5 miles wide. The actual marsh basin covers about 25,000 acres. With the uplands around it in public ownership, it's a little over 33,000 acres today. Of course, like so much of Wisconsin, that whole basin of Horicon was formed during the last ice age. And it was a time of cold worldwide temperatures, massive ice sheets, and of course also that age of mammals. To really understand how the glaciers moved across eastern Wisconsin to form the Horicon Basin, you need a little bit of introduction to the bedrock geology. And really, eastern Wisconsin, the main geology has to do with the Niagara Escarpment. It is an outcropping of the limestone, the Niagara limestone, that forms a shallow cliff. In southern part of the state, it's buried by glacial debris. It comes to the surface just south of Horicon, makes up that high ground along the eastern side of Horicon Marsh. Lake Winnebago, the entire east side, is framed by a prominent cliff up in the northeast corner. High Cliff State Park sits there, and it continues out to the tip of the Door County Peninsula. And anyone who's been at Door County, you know that along the Green Bay side, you've got the limestone cliffs dropping right down to the lake. You go across to the other side, it's a sand-washed beach. It's literally tipped and bowed coming out of the ground to form that cliff. It goes under Lake Michigan, under Lake Huron and Erie, comes up 100 miles to the east, forms Niagara Falls, where it gets its name. This had a direct influence on the direction of the glaciers. So as they began to advance into Wisconsin, they split right off the tip of the Door County Peninsula. To the east, where that bedrock dips down low, was a soft layer of shale. It gouged that out, removed all of that to create the Lake Michigan Basin. To the west, the glaciers crept right along the edge of the escarpment and created 3 major basins across east central Wisconsin. First of those is the inlet of Lake Michigan, Green Bay. Beyond that, Lake Winnebago and the Horicon Marsh. As the glaciers were advancing for quite a while, that escarpment, or as we call it, the ledge, held back the glaciers, forcing them south and west. But as the ice continued to advance and got thicker and deeper, it surmounted that escarpment, spread toward the east. At the same time, the Lake Michigan Glacier crept out of the present-day lake bed, and those 2 ice masses that had been separated ran into each other and they sandwiched here all this glacial debris to create the Kettle Moraine. Now the ice was pushing forward, it just simply melted back as the climate began to warm. It was not a steady progression of just a straight melting, it was a series of stages where the ice would melt back, pause and rest on the land, and then recede again in steps and stages. Every time it came to rest, it laid down moraine deposits. And between Madison and Fond du Lac, there are 7 very distinctive moraines showing that progressive shrinking of the ice. There was a wonderful study that was done between 1910 and 1919 by William Alden, who mapped out all of these glacial features, and he found that there was actually this shrinking and retreating of the ice from the south and from the west. And another map here, we can actually see those remnants of the recessional moraines. They're somewhat broken because it didn't have a lot of debris or a lot of time to lay down a continuous moraine. One of the very important pausing points was right here, and it formed that Green Lake moraine. It stopped right at the south end of Horicon. So it melted back that far. The marsh was still frozen solid. Meltwater had to go south. That gave rise to the Rock River, and it laid a moraine down right across the south end of what is the present-day marsh. As the ice receded from there, that moraine acted like an earthen dam, and about 12,000 years ago, Horicon began as a big, shallow lake like Lake Winnebago. Of course, Lake Winnebago drains to the north over bedrock. That's why it still persists. Here, this was held back only by the debris of the glacier. That's sand, gravel, boulders, and other material that was laid down. It was a poorly built earthen dam, and over time, it began to erode that outlet, slowly draining the lake, but of course not completely. It eventually left behind the Horicon Marsh. So as I mentioned, the Ice Age was not just a time of cold worldwide temperatures and massive ice sheets. It also was the age of mammals, and we've got quite a bit of evidence of these animal remains being found in Wisconsin. In fact, we've got some nice upper tooth and tusk fragments of woolly mammoth that came out just west of the marsh. Now, we also know that the first major invasion of early people in North America coming across the Bering Land Bridge met these animals and hunted them. The early Paleo-Indians, or what we're called the mammoth hunters. It's still somewhat open to debate whether or not the animals simply were dying out and disappearing because of climate change at that time, thawing out of the Ice Age, or were they hunted to extinction? There's still some debate over that. My guess, it was probably environmental change that really pushed them. These people were just taking advantage of the last few that were surviving before they disappeared. Now, the Native Americans never had a written language, so we have no, say, direct text to go to as we do for the ancient Egyptians or the Mayans. What we know about the people that lived here thousands of years ago is from the artifact material they left behind. What you're looking at right now is only half of a single collection of artifacts that were found on the west side of the marsh, and I've seen a dozen of these collections. There are thousands of arrowheads, as we call them generically, that have been excavated there. And if you look at them, you see there's a lot of different sizes and shapes and so forth. The fact is, the actual arrowhead is for bow and arrow. These are the little ones. These are spear points. This is a knife blade. These are drill bits. And also, right here, this is an extremely old one. This is a Clovis tip from the mammoth hunters. This is Scott's Bluff. These are covering a whole period of 12,000 years of history. So different people had different styles of this. So when we take a look at the archaeological record for Horicon Marsh, we can say confidently that every major prehistoric Indian culture known to the upper Midwest either inhabited or utilized the Horicon Marsh over that long period. It was a continuous human occupation from the end of the Ice Age to today. So beginning with the early Paleo-Indians, our mammoth hunters, tool types changed as the big animals died out. We went into that long archaic period, and finally a real diversification of lifestyle tools, development of agriculture in the woodland period. And for us, one of the most important is the effigy mound building period. 98% of all the effigy mounds in the world are found in Wisconsin. This is our archetype. And myself and my good friend Kurt Sampson just finished a book on the Indian mounds of Dodge County. I do have copies here available today. It was the last 3 years of continuous writing and research. We've been on it for over 10 years, and actually we just got the delivery a week ago. Now, Indian mounds are both the conical mounds, as you see on the left, and we see a very low-profile mammal-shaped mound at the Nitschke mounds. Those are the true effigy mounds. These are the sites in Dodge County alone. 135 known mound sites, which consisted of anywhere from one single mound to over 200 mounds at a site. And you notice that they're clustered along that whole east side of Horicon Marsh. They're almost on top of each other. To the west of the marsh, around Beaver Dam Lake, Fox Lake, and down by the southwest where the junction of the Beaver Dam and Crawfish Rivers were, which is, of course, the very rich resource areas. So we've just finished a 500-page book on it. We found 135 mound sites consisting of 1,094 mounds. That's an absolute minimum count. We figure is probably, with some fuzzy documentation and lost history, perhaps as many as 1,400 mounds that were built just in Dodge County alone. In addition to that, for all of the existing mound sites, or almost all of them, we also included LiDAR imagery. And so here you can actually see these are the Coulterman mounds. Look at the conicals and this beautiful panther. Here's a nice goose mound. These are the Clark mounds and others in here. And this whole series, they really stand out with that modern imagery. Of all of the sites, the most spectacular sat where the city of Horicon is today. This was mapped out by Increase Lapham, October 1851. And you just take a look at this exotic, very elaborate series of mounds that he had mapped here. It was one of the most spectacular sites anywhere, and we're lucky that he did this because in less than 40 years they were gone. This is the only record we have of those mounds at the site. And also that's why I chose this particular image for the cover of our book. It not only shows how spectacular some of these were, but also how fragile. Now, the early environment or vegetation of the area around Horicon Marsh came from the land records, and what it indicates is that not only do we have this huge marsh as a major hunting ground, but it was the dividing boundary between the prairie and savanna to the west and the forest to the east. All three elements came together here of grassland, wetland, and woodland, which made this such an extremely important resource site. And on top of that, there's the headwaters of the Rock River. You had a trading network with other people downstream for exotic goods and materials. It also was the dividing boundary between the Winnebago Indians or Ho-Chunk Nation and the Potawatomis, right along the Rock River and the Horicon Marsh. In fact, there was historical notes of villages facing each other right in this area and down here. So they basically agreed that that was the separation between them. Where the city of Horicon lies today, right there, was not just only the site of those effigy mounds I just showed you, but in early historic times, that was a major Winnebago village of over 2,000 people. It was called Munkshaka. In 1838, an early fur trader and trapper came through the area, made note that right there where that Indian village was located, at the foot of the marsh, on the high ground with the river running, would be a beautiful place for a settlement. He made note of it for others, but didn't actually settle there. His name, by the way, is Solomon Juneau, the founder of Milwaukee. He finally settled to the east of Horicon, a little town that we call Teresa. He named that after his mother, nice guy that he was. So with the Black Hawk War, the removal of the Native Americans from the area, this was now the site that Solomon Juneau noted in 1838. The city itself was founded in 1845. And here's sort of an early artist rendition of Horicon. You see the Rock River winding out. Those effigy mounds were right along here and here on the banks of the river. Everything changed almost immediately. The city was founded in 1845. For a source of power, they built a small dam to power the first sawmill. 1846, they enlarged that dam, and it was built 150 feet across the river with big logs, rocks, mud, and hay. It was 9 feet high, flooded the marsh more than 5 feet above what you see today, and they claimed that they had created the largest man-made lake in the world for its time. That's why it was important to understand the glacial history. It was a lake 12,000 years ago. It just eroded that narrow outlet, plugged that up, and they flooded the whole thing all over again. So Lake Horicon existed then for 23 years. It was a real boom to a lot of people, and here's one of the few early pictures looking at the lake from roughly where the old headquarters was on Palmatory, looking west to 1 Mile Island. So it was a great recreation area, wonderful fishing. It was a benefit also for commerce and tourism, bringing the lumber and also farm goods across to eventually the railroad in the city of Horicon. There also was big tourism. There were 5 steamboats that were operating on Lake Horicon in the 1850s and 1860s. So for some people, it was a tremendous benefit. The problem is the high ground is to the east as the land rises up toward the escarpment. To the west is a low, rolling, undulating plain. When you put more than 5 feet of water on, they flooded large areas of land to the west of it, and of course inundated the farmers. And as a result, they took their concerns to the court. It went all the way up to the state Supreme Court, and in 1869, the dam was removed. The picture you see here is from the Milwaukee Journal, 1925. They were rebuilding the bridge across the river, right where the dam was, and here we see those logs still remaining in the bottom of the river, that foundation at that time. So that was the first era of the marsh, the big alterations, damming, flooding from 1845, 1846 really, to 1869. Once the dam was removed, it returned back to a wetland, and this is some of the earliest description that we have of what the original marsh looked like. They talked about large areas of shallow water, emergent vegetation, massive stands of wild rice, floating bog, cranberry bog. Essentially, it was a mosaic of many different wetland types, all together across more than 25,000 acres. And when most of us grew up, we knew a Horicon Marsh as this big Canada goose stopover. Back then, it wasn't a goose marsh, it was a duck marsh. With all the ducks that were coming there, and of course at a time when before any conservation laws had even been enacted, and the public perception was that wildlife was an unlimited resource, there were two major hunting efforts that took place at Horicon during that era. One of those was private clubs. There were 6 major hunting clubs on the marsh. The very first one was called the Caw-Caw Club. The first name was Quaw-Quaw, coming from the squawking of the heron colony nearby. They set up in 1856 when it was still a lake. So they were on the western shore of it. When they removed the dam, they were sitting high and dry, and rather than move closer to the marsh, they relocated to Lake Puckaway. The Caw-Caw Club finally folded in 2005, making it the oldest long-term running hunting club in the upper Midwest. They were followed by the Horicon Shooting Club, the Fond du Lac Club, the Strux Club, Greenhead Club, and the Diana. Between those different groups, different clubs, they fell into 2 major groups. There were the local clubs and the out-of-towner clubs, and all of those were exclusive to one way or another. The local clubs were literally good old boys clubs, and they had in their charter a limited number of members that they would ever have. The only one that's still running today is the Greenhead Club. Their charter originally said no more than 17 members. They've now raised it to 21. And I told anybody that came to the marsh, if you want to join the Greenhead Club, here's what you got to do. You go make a good friend with one of those guys. You take him out for dinner. You go duck hunting with him. You hang around and you put your name in and you wait for somebody to either quit or die. And that's the only way you're going to get in. The out-of-towner clubs, they were also exclusive. Kind of like a nice country club today. The membership fees were so high that only the wealthiest businessmen from Chicago and Milwaukee were able to really afford it. So they excluded an awful lot of people one way or another. Now the one thing we can say about the hunting clubs is they practiced the first form of conservation on Horicon Marsh. At a time when there were no hunting laws, rules, or regulations, they did not allow the members to shoot ducks in spring, and they set the very first bag limits on the marsh. 25 ducks a day. May not sound like conservation to us, but it was a restriction. Horicon Marsh was also the stage for one of the most important water resource laws to be settled in the state of Wisconsin. I'm sure many of you know Mike Lutz. He used to bring his law student interns up to Horicon for me to talk about this story because he said he still cites it today in any case that goes to the courts over water rights. Husting versus the Diana Shooting Club. Paul Husting was a native of the city of Mayville. He went to Marquette Law School, he got into the Wisconsin legislature, and he finally became a U.S. Senator. Besides being a law student and a politician, he was also a member and eventually the president of the Greenhead Hunting Club. This was the latecomer. They didn't get established till 1905. So Paul Husting belonged to the Greenhead Hunting Club. They were up the river. In fact, if anybody's familiar with this, this is right next to our public boat landing on the Rock River as it flows into the marsh. So they had their own private land for a club, but they had to share the marsh with everyone else for hunting. So here was the Greenhead Club up the river. On the west side was the Diana Shooting Club. That was the out-of-towner club. The Diana Club was something that was run by this man, Willard Van Brunt. Willard Van Brunt was the wealthiest industrialist in all of Dodge County. He owned the Van Brunt Implement Company. They made the farming equipment. He eventually sold out to John Deere. So here's the Van Brunt company. And besides being a wealthy industrialist and businessman, he was also an avid duck hunter. Here's one of his holiday cards that he sent out to his friends. He also was the president of the Diana Shooting Club. And by the way, Diana Shooting Club takes its name from the Roman goddess of hunting. And here it is, W. Van Brunt, August 1883, as president. Well, they had such exclusive use of the marsh, they had their own railroad stop. The train that came from Chicago, Milwaukee, along the west side of Horicon Marsh and toward the Twin Cities would stop at Swan Road and let the hunters off. The horse team was there to pick them up in a carriage, take them right down. This was just a clubhouse for the locals. They would have a dining hall, wine and dine them. This was on the Miskey farm. They could go out onto the marsh, and this is sort of dressed up a little bit for a Sunday photo shoot, but they would go out there, shoot the ducks. The workers there would take care, dress their ducks and everything else. They would just sit back, and they could enjoy their whole weekend. Most of these people came from Milwaukee, Chicago, and some all the way from Boston and New York to hunt on this club ground. They also built their own dam right on the Rock River, flooded thousands of acres in front of their own clubhouse, and they hired their own private wardens to arrest anybody who dare go onto the grounds of the Diana Shooting Club. Well, Paul Husting, as I said, he was a law student. He worked on water laws for Wisconsin, and he clearly understood the Northwest Ordinance, rights of navigation, and what became adopted into the Wisconsin Constitution as a public trust doctrine. In 1914, he took his little skiff. He paddled into the grounds of the Diana Shooting Club, sat in the navigable channel, had himself arrested, defended himself all the way up to the state Supreme Court. And this was the big showdown. This little guy defeated the Diana Shooting Club because they had no right to privatize a navigable waterway. It killed the club. It ended right there. And we still cite Husting versus Diana Shooting Club in almost any legal argument or discussion on water rights in Wisconsin today. Paul Husting, by the way, in the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame. Now, as I said, the duck hunting, they had restrictions on spring shooting and also fall hunting, on their bag limits, 25 ducks a day, which seems liberal certainly to us, but at least there was some restriction because you see the rest of the marsh was not just open to a wide open year-round shoot, but this was a major area for market hunting. And if you were living in Wisconsin 150 years ago, you could have gone to the store in season and you could have bought not just beef, pork, and chicken, but they would have sold you venison, duck, goose, crane, passenger pigeon, all of it for sale. And these were professional hunters. Their job was to slaughter wildlife, to sell it. The more you could shoot, the more you could sell, the more money you could make. And Horicon was a major area for the duck industry. The way they hunted the ducks was not like you think of today, to put out a few decoys, call a few in, and shoot them as they fly by. They would bait the birds. They would go out early in the migration, loaded with sacks of shelled corn, dump that into the shallow water like a big aquatic bird feeder. And if anybody's ever fed songbirds at home, you know, you fill up your feeder this time of year, you put it out, takes a few days for the first chickadee to even find it. Next thing you know, the word gets around. Well, same thing here. It takes a random chance for the first few ducks to find the bait pile. They become the decoys and everybody else joins them. When the water was black and with hundreds of birds, they would use these punt guns to shoot into it. This is a small one. This is only a 4-gauge shotgun. They would even use 2-gauge shotguns. When they pulled the triggers, flames came out for 25 to 30 feet, and it easily slaughtered 50 to 100 ducks at a time. Here's a picture off the Fox River on the upper part of the Winnebago chain. That was a good day of hunting. Here's a day from Horicon. And you can see why it didn't last. Shooting these ducks in spring and fall without any limits devastated the waterfowl population. The ducks at this point all but disappeared. Now keep in mind, we still had an intact, healthy marsh ecosystem in its original state. It was home to all the wildlife that had always been there except for the ducks that we had just skimmed off. If we could have protected the marsh at that time, allowed those last few birds to come back, raise families, rebuild the population, we could have recovered the waterfowl population. But you see, today we think of wetlands for multiple values, not just as a duck or goose or waterfowl area, but for its biodiversity. We recognize they're valuable for recharging our groundwater, cleansing surface water, flood attenuation, all these multiple values that we attribute to wetlands. Back then, whether it was the market hunters or the duck hunting clubs, the Horicon Marsh had only one single value. It was a duck marsh, period. And it comes down to this: by the early 1900s, what is the value of a duck marsh when you've shot almost all the ducks off of it? Not much. They referred to this as the wasteland. So they wanted now to do something with the marsh to reap another economic benefit. In 1910, local developers backed by investors from Chicago had this machinery shipped up in pieces. They brought it over by a horse team to the north end, right near where Highway 49 is today, hand dug a pool and erected this. And here was the whole fanfare, everybody in their Sunday best for that first day that they're going to launch the dredge. The job of that was to ditch and drain the Horicon Marsh to convert it to agricultural purposes. The dredge was digging a ditch 8 feet deep, 60 feet wide, and ran it for 14 miles down the full length of the marsh and around the first two bends of the river. The people who worked on it actually lived there. You could not possibly take your little skiff and commute every day. They had a bunkhouse in the back and even their own cook. And so these people lived on it, and from the time the ice broke up in spring until the marsh froze again in fall, they labored at what they thought was an important work here to improve the Horicon Marsh. At one point, the dredge even sunk out there. They resurrected. They were not to be deterred. I believe in the background, you're actually seeing what was added later on as a floating bunkhouse for the workers. Later on, they even brought in a second dredge to hurry up the job. So if you can imagine this oval-shaped basin of Horicon, they cut the main ditch from north to south. Then they went back and cut the lateral ditches from the middle to each side to drain the backwaters of the middle, to drain all of that out, hoping to dry up the marsh, to make it something they could farm. And here's what we're looking at when the job was done. This is right by the Chestnut Street boat landing. You're looking north. These are the dredge spoils. Simply the peat gouged out of the bottom and thrown on the side. That's still there today. Now it's all lined with black willow and cottonwood. So originally the hydrology of the marsh was two main rivers, the west branch of the Rock River and the east branch, with a couple small creeks flowing in. This would meander and flow through the marsh. You can almost see the old river channels as it broke apart here and wound, and here's some oxbows. It's sort of a braided stream system as it washed through. What they did was to cut this ditch straight down. Here are the lateral ditches, and we completely changed that hydrology of the marsh forever. If you fly over the marsh today, you're going to see there's that main ditch. You see the laterals going off to the side and the old river channel over on the right-hand side of the picture. As the marsh began to dry up, they had this large farm machinery. They started to encroach on it, plowing under the native vegetation and exposing the rich soil. The tractors actually had these huge steel tires so they wouldn't get bogged down in that soft peat soil. For those who could not afford to buy in or lease these tractors, they had a local invention called the marsh shoes. I actually had a couple of them that somebody gave us. These were wooden blocks that were strapped to the horse's feet like snowshoes so they wouldn't get stuck in the muck pulling the plows. So here we can see them plowing under that emergent vegetation and exposing what looked like a very rich black soil. But this was an organic soil, not a mineral soil. This was the semi-decomposed plant material that had been building up in those shallow waters for thousands of years. So it had a lot of hope and promise, but they quickly started running into problems. It took until 1916 to finish all the ditches. 1916, 1917 were flood years. So a lot of them weren't able to plant their crops early enough. The other problem was a loss of fertility. As the soil it was exposed to the atmosphere. Oh. Okay. So, as I say, this soil, once it was exposed to the atmosphere, began to oxidize and started to losing its fertility as it was decomposing. A couple of rounds of crops on it was sucking the nutrients out of it, and there were no artificial fertilizers. This was actually on the original picture when I got it. Plowing the peatlands for suckers. So the word was they used to harvest the suckers out of the rivers and throw them out there as fertilizer. Now, the people who developed this bought the land from the Railroad Commission at 15 to 20 bucks an acre. They sold it to the locals for as much as $200 an acre. They put their life savings into it. And the sales pitch was, don't worry about that. You're going to have such bounteous crops, you'll pay that off in no time. I think suckers also refers to something more than just a fish. Those are the poor people who got taken by these investors. So to try to ameliorate this, the Rock River oftentimes had these long winters with the real oxygen depletion, so they cut holes in the ice and the fish were just gasping for any air, and they were taking rakes and just shoveling up primarily suckers, carp, and other fish, and threw them out on the field. Some were, of course, pickled and used for food, and others were thrown out in the field, or the offal was thrown out there as fertilizer. So they tried what they could, but they started running into problems. And about the year 1920-21, especially in the southern portion of the marsh, the farmers began to abandon that effort. They realized they were never going to get the return. It was not as productive as they thought. It was way too much effort, and they just left the land abandoned now, ditched, drained, and tilled up. And now the worst was yet to come, because that organic soil out here in summertime began to heat up and decompose very rapidly, and like wet hay, if you have too much moisture in your hay and you load up a barn with it, you get a barn fire, and that's what happened. Spontaneous combustion, this lit up. Fires burned on Horicon Marsh all through the 1920s to the early 30s for a period of 12 years. The biggest fire burned for 3 years continuously. What they saw as a wasteland was nothing compared when they got done with it. This is one of only 2 pictures ever taken that I could find of the aftermath. Here you see the last clumps of peat. Literally 10,000 years of peat accumulation went up in smoke. They had destroyed not just a duck population, but an entire wetland ecosystem on a massive scale. Horicon Marsh by the 1920s was ditched, drained, on fire, dead and gone. Louis Radke was a native from the city of Horicon. He worked at the John Deere plant as a supervisor. He also was a statewide president of the Isaac Walton League. He took it upon himself to start a campaign to save the Horicon Marsh. He got together his band of people, and rather than doing any work themselves to restore the marsh, they became a political lobby force. They worked here in Madison with the state legislature from 1921 through 1927. Finally convinced the state legislature to come out and take a look at Horicon Marsh and its potential to be restored as a wetland. With that, they passed into law the Horicon Marsh Wildlife Refuge Bill in 1927, creating the very first state wildlife area in Wisconsin. The state legislature provided $10,000 a year for 10 years to buy the land, and also a special appropriation to build a dam in the city of Horicon, which we still operate today, not to flood it and to make a lake of it, but that's what put out the fires, and again, provided that sheet water for the restoration of the marsh. Curly Radke, by the way, was remembered for his efforts August 20th, 1955, with a ceremony on what was called Conservation Hill. We know it as the old DNR headquarters at Palmatory Street. And there they erected this monument. It says on there, for a lifetime devoted to Wisconsin conservation and the restoration of Horicon Marsh in memory of Louis Curly Radke. That monument still sits today. And Curly Radke is also in the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame. So what you're seeing out there is not this preserved marsh as the woman had once assumed it to be. Instead, what we have here, this is a restored wetland system. Now, the state of Wisconsin was given money every year for 10 years. They began to buy it, but by the time the money ran out, they'd only acquired about 10,000 acres, the southern third of the marsh. It would have taken several more legislative sessions and several more decades to even buy the land, much less to begin to work on it and restore it. It had shown such a quick recovery and such a potential for conservation. It was known across the entire nation. And in 1941, the federal government came in to complete the job, buying the northern two-thirds of the marsh. And that's why we have 2 separate units to Horicon Marsh, the southern third as a state wildlife area under the management of DNR, the northern two-thirds a national wildlife refuge managed by Fish and Wildlife Service. Just a matter of history. We began it. They came in to build on that effort. Horicon Marsh is also one of the 9 units of the Ice Age National Scientific Reserve. It's such a spectacular example of an extinct glacial lake. It is part of that National Reserve system. We have no national parks in Wisconsin, but we do have the Ice Age Reserve. Great examples of the Wisconsin Ice Age. Other recognitions for the marsh? It is our first important bird area in Wisconsin. The Important Bird Areas program began in Europe. Recognizing in the 1980s the decline of birds across Europe, they decided if they were going to protect and save the birds in Europe, they needed to look at the most important places where they live, they stop over migration, and where they nest, and protect them and rank them as locally important, regionally important, nationally, and internationally important sites, and they had a very uniform set of criteria of how to rank those. When the important bird areas came to the United States, it was something that the American Bird Conservancy took on, and they delegated to each state to nominate it. When it started in Wisconsin, I was asked to take a look at Horicon and try to provide that data and information for some sort of a recognition, because anybody who owns binoculars knows that Horicon is one of the best places to go watch birds. It is an important bird area, but how important? They considered it to be a globally important bird area. The protection of the birds at Horicon Marsh is not just important for Wisconsin, the Midwest, or the United States. We literally have birds stopping there right now, and in spring again, coming from deep in South America on their way to the Arctic. It is a link for the entire Western Hemisphere for birds. It is a globally important bird area, and one more recognition for the marsh. Under the Ramsar Convention of the United Nations, Ramsar, by the way, like the Helsinki Accord, Kyoto Accord, that was Ramsar, Iran. In 1976, the United Nations members recognized the importance of the wetlands and their loss, and they obligated every member nation to recognize at least one wetland in their country that would be identified as internationally important. And again, they had a very uniform criteria. Our staff at Horicon got together all the data we could, and we were recognized as number 11 of all the Ramsar sites very quickly on in this process. And these are basically recognized the best of the best wetlands in the United States, including the Everglades, Okefenokee Swamp, Chesapeake Bay, and our own Horicon Marsh. Horicon's important in a lot of ways for bird conservation, for certainly its research that has been conducted there by people like Dick Hunt, and so important for visitors. We estimate, and I will say a rough estimate, of over 500,000 people a year. We don't really have good solid numbers because there's no one entrance gate. And I've always questioned, well, if a person drives across Highway 49, pulls off to the side and looks at a couple of birds, is that a visit? Do they have to get out of the car? So what is really constitutes it? But we figure at least 500,000 people, and that translates in probably $5 to $7 million in ecotourism dollars every year. So it has an economic value. And ecotourism has certainly become a big part of the sales for a lot of things, but long before we ever coined that phrase, Horicon already had its ecotourism. Take a look here, 1960s. You can tell from the models of the cars, that's when the Canada geese were showing up at the marsh, and the federal refuge tried to hold them on the marsh by feeding them while they cleaned out the food in 7 to 10 days and then hit all the farmers. But we had such a hoopla, such a show here, they literally had to bring out the highway patrol and the sheriff's department to keep the traffic going. The locals told me that normally that's a 10-minute drive across Highway 49 to get to Waupun. On a fall afternoon, like right now, October, on a weekend, it would take 2 to 3 hours to get across. And all it took was one person to hit the brakes and, oh, look at all the geese, and boom, they backed them up for literally miles. And here's what they came to see. This is that famous picture by Edgar Miller showing the Canada geese on the marsh when we had 250,000 birds stopping over there, which of course followed with the goose wars and things we don't have time to even get into. So ecotourism was beginning here long before it ever caught on anywhere else. And geese are still important to the marsh, but when I started, geese were still unique as a fall phenomenon. I had a lot of visitors coming, and in fact, I also believe I had some of the largest audiences ever for outdoor interpretive talks. And I knew I had to prove my job was going to be interesting to the public. So what I did is I actually called up the feds and said, can I go up to the north end onto your viewing area where it's the best place to watch the geese come in at the end of the day, and can I do a public talk up there? They said, oh, sure, that'll help us because we don't have an interpretive staff. Go right ahead. So I made sure every Saturday and Sunday afternoon in fall, I would go up to the Highway 49 view area on the northeast corner of the marsh, and I would have what I called the goose talk. I was literally drawing 600 to 800 people for a single outdoor talk every weekend. The geese were huge, and it began to slowly wane as the giant Canada goose population built up and they overran our parks, golf courses, became commonplace. It still is a unique phenomenon to see geese like never before, but they become so widespread, we don't see that real draw. As that began to wane a bit, I spent the rest of my career trying to make Horicon remake it from the goose marsh to really a wildlife, wetland ecosystem for all of its wildlife and benefits. As David mentioned, I had a chance to meet with an awful lot of people, and during that time I provided professional training for 66 delegations of scientists from 43 countries. This was one of the first ones I had from Vietnam and Cambodia. They were there through the International Crane Foundation. And this man, Dr. Mui Ne, came and heard the story of the marsh, its destruction, its abuse, its restoration, its management. He was so convinced of what he heard here, he went back to Vietnam and worked with their government and declared an area of the Mekong Delta as the first wildlife refuge in Vietnam. I also had a chance to talk with scientists from Bhutan, Nepal, Tibet, my colleagues from Siberia. We made sure it was 20 below, nice winter day for them. And the last delegation I had brought it full circle for me. Again, from Vietnam came the biologist to learn. It was the next generation. This gentleman right here is now the manager and director of the Tram Chin Reserve in the Mekong Delta of Vietnam. He's also Dr. Mui Ne's grandson. The last thing I worked on was to try to give a home to these education programs. I always just did them outdoors for the people. And I spent 17 years in fundraising campaign, and the last 2.5 years, the construction of the Horicon Education Center, the place that we would have for the education programs. That was where I finished things up, the end of a long, bittersweet experience. And so with that, that is our story of Horicon Marsh. I think a well-known wetland, certainly a well-recognized one, and something that everybody here no doubt has some familiarity with. I'm hoping that you learned something different today. Thank you.
Any questions?
Yes?
Yeah, I'm curious about the restoration efforts. Were the big ditches ever filled or partially
No,
filled?
we've talked about that, but first of all, you got a couple of problems. They dug that up, threw it on the side, it sloughed off, and now you got trees rooted. To try to do that, fill it back in, it's going to be a huge effort. And the question also is, will we really see a greater benefit to the wetland with all that invested effort? Right now, our bigger effort is just to hang on to what we have. Now, we change the hydrology, not just with the ditches and the drainage of or the rerouting of the waterway, but we also then worked with dikes to impound it all and hold the water back. So what we now have is stagnant standing water, which also becomes sediment and nutrient traps. So we've altered it in a whole ecological sense as well. And that would be a whole nother talk to get into the ecology of the marsh and what we're seeing with high nutrient inputs and what I refer to as a chain reaction of events that's reverberating through the system. And really an understanding that we have of the marsh that only came to light in barely the last 20 years. Starting to understand it as a very complex ecosystem. The problem now is not just what we need to do within the marsh, but the problems are coming throughout the watershed. 500 square miles of land under private use. So it's really at the receiving end of everything we happen up there. It's the barometer of how we're using the land. And that's going to be the tough thing. And that becomes not just an agricultural problem, which is a major land use there. It's a social, political, cultural problem. And how are we going to get everybody in line on that? That's the tough one. We've made gains. Can we hang on to them right now? Yes?
I had the impression when I was working with the DNR that Horicon Marsh on the state property over time became a gargantuan cattail monotype with much reduced diversity from its historic value where open water was interspersed with much lighter residuals.
Yep.
And Harold Mathiak and Arlen Lindy
Yep.
supervised the harvest of hundreds of thousands of muskrats
Yes.
that kept open patches within the cattail monotype. Is there anything that could be done to restore greater diversity to that gargantuan cattail monotype?
Well, that's going to be a tough challenge. We tried planting wild rice with the soft silt muck bottom that we have there. It just doesn't root sufficiently. It just can't stand itself up. We never got it to really take. And yeah, you're right, cattail has taken over. Cattail does really well in high nutrient waters, and that's the problem. We created these impoundments, which are sediment traps. This bottom has changed from a firm peat to a soft muck, and we have extremely high nutrient inputs. Between 2000 and 2003, we did monitoring of the water coming in with U.S. Geological Survey, monitoring stations. We calculated 26 million pounds of topsoil a year and 135,000 pounds of phosphorus comes in. That's what has supercharged the marsh, allowed the cattails to get a stand. And that's the real challenge. So just like the hydrology to try to put it back or try to diversify the plant life, we don't know how much more we can make of the marsh today. The bigger challenge is to hang on to what we even have, considering we still have this high nutrient and sediment load coming in.
I also wanted you to comment on the more recent colonization by the white pelican.
Oh, sure. Horicon was the second place where pelicans began to nest. First one was 1996 at Green Bay, 4 years later at Horicon. And yeah, they've kind of exploded out there. At one point, the Fish and Wildlife Service was wondering why there were so many sitting on the north impoundment out by Potato Lake area and what they were feeding on, so they put a pike net out. They left it out for 2 days. They said when they tried to lift the pike net up to see what was in there, 3 people couldn't even lift the net. It was so full of little carp like this. So I had a lot of tourists tell me, oh, that's great, they're going to eat up the carp. They're never going to eat them all. They're too prolific. They're just skimming off the top and feasting on them. It's not a control. But let them eat them, I don't care. Just like the cormorants, let them have at it. It's just another mix. The other thing I always pondered about is this for Horicon. Why is it that still today we have such a high diversity of birds and other wildlife on a marsh that is so highly simplified? Hydrologically very simplified, stagnant water and high nutrients, and as you said, vegetatively, not this mosaic of many wetland types, but mostly a big, vast cattail marsh. I think what we have is no longer a diversity in composition, but a diversity in structure. What I mean by that, we no longer have this whole variety of plants, but we have 25,000 acres of wetland where we have variable water levels, variable densities of cattails, and open water, and that at least is providing the opportunities for this vast array of birds and other animals. 305 species of birds have been identified out there. But as I tell people, that list will slowly grow as something else gets lost and ends up there. My concern is not for the newest bird to show up. They don't belong there anyhow. I'm more concerned about the ones that show up every year and depend on the marsh as part of their life cycle. So it's kind of a unique paradox that we have made such a simplified system, but it's still supporting a diversity of wildlife. And as I've emphasized before, we're not going to try to make much more of it. Of course, the money isn't there, nor the staff time and effort, but just to hang on to what we have and understand it so that we don't lose anything more of the marsh. If we lose that, the second time around, it'll be even worse. It'll be worse in terms of loss culturally, socially, historically. Yeah.
Yeah, Bill, when I started at Warden 45 years ago or so, there were people who were working, they were old men who talked about they had to do guard duty on the dam.
Oh, yeah.
So what were the time periods that the threats of going up the dam were?
1929 to 1934. It went to the state courts a couple of times, and there were actual orders to open the dam, release the water. The state won again an injunction. They closed it, and then there were these threats to blow it up. And yeah, there always were these conflicts. And what you're going to find, that's another part of the history of the marsh, there's always been conflicts between those who worked in the marsh and those who lived around it. Just the same way there were conflicts with the farmers over the geese and DNR and Fish and Wildlife Service. There were conflicts for those who built the dam and benefited from it and those who got flooded out. That has been always part of the story. That's one of the underlying themes. And I really had hoped, I'll say this much personally, I had hoped that this story of changing human relationships and evolving understanding the marsh would have been the theme for the exhibit hall for that education center. Unfortunately, that did not come to pass, and some other people worked on that one.
Bill, you want to comment on Harold Mathiak and his handicap and what he did?
Harold Mathiak only had one arm, yes, he was an amputee. He did some of the foundational work on muskrat ecology and set the basis for the entire trapping program on Horicon Marsh. And yeah, I've actually just downloaded recently again his paper. You can find it online in the DNR Research Library on muskrat ecology. Between him and Paul Arrington out of Iowa were the two most fundamental ones. Basically what he said about muskrats, and you saw a decline of muskrats, and that's just change in the marsh environment. I had guys telling me, oh, well, you just harvested too many. Harold Mathiak showed us you cannot over-harvest muskrat. 4 to 8 young per litter, 2 to 4 litters a year. Average lifespan, 18 months, and that's after they get out. If you consider also add in infant mortality, it's barely 9-month life expectancy, but they're busy. They're doing just like the rabbits would. They're always producing young, so you cannot trap out the muskrats. And so we had the trapping harvest, especially in the 70s and 80s. They were huge. The biggest year ever was, I think it was 1976. On the state and federal areas of the marsh combined, 125,000 muskrats were taken out in one fall season. There were guys who actually came up to me and said, you know, I used to come out here and bid on it. I would lay down and they wanted cash on hand. $6,000, $8,000, and even $12,000 on the day the bids went out. They would put this money out there, the state would collect it. They made that money back and a profit. I had 3 guys tell me they bought a brand new truck or their first truck off of muskrats.
How many birds do you think Harold banded in his lifetime?
I have to go into the bird banding records for that one, but he even continued in his backyard. He would catch even the yellow-headed
A
black.
guy with one arm banding his little tiny, using his little tiny bird bands. I always wondered, how did he do it? But he did it. He was an archer with one hand. He went deer hunting with a bow, long bow. How did he do it? He did it.
I would say he's another person who deserves recognition for the Hall of Fame. And Horicon's produced a couple. I already mentioned Paul Houston, Curly Radke, and one of my very dear friends, and I would say not only a colleague but a mentor, Dick Hunt. All 3 of those came out of Horicon and are in the Hall of Fame. It's been a breeding ground for people like that because it's a marsh that can teach us so much. Well, I'll hang around and answer this talk on later on. We could go on for a whole afternoon. I'm just getting warmed up myself, but I'm going to let you go. Thank you.